Hi babies, and welcome back to my channel. It's your girl Hena Bryan, aka Bookish Babe, and I am joined by the fantastic Cecilia Rabess to discuss her debut novel, Everything's Fine. I guess I just want to start by asking you to just give us a brief synopsis of your book so that the viewers know a bit more about it.
Cool. Yeah, first, thanks for this conversation. I'm really excited to speak with you. So Everything's Fine is a novel about two very different young people, and they fall reluctantly, complicatedly, passionately in love. Jess is our protagonist. She meets Josh. Jess is Black, Josh is white. Jess is liberal, Josh is conservative. So I think in a lot of ways, this is a familiar story. You know, opposites attract, tale as old as time. But I think what makes kind of a timeless story feel very timely is that it's set between the years of 2008 and 2016, so bookended by Obama and Trump's presidencies. And so the arc of their relationship traces the arc of America's increasingly fractured political climate. And so it's a love story, but it's also a story that asks questions, a lot of difficult questions about race and class and politics and identity. And I've said this before, but I'll keep saying it. It's not so much a will they, won't they, as a should they, shouldn't they. So that's kind of how I summarize it in a few sentences.
That's a fantastic summary. What I mentioned to you earlier is that this book really stressed me out.
Yeah.
Because of the whole opposites attract and Jess being one way, Josh being another. Whilst the love it was like so intoxicating, you kind of wanted them to work, but it just didn't because of, as you said, like the political climate and how in the real world they just did not stand a chance. So I guess I want to know, what was your process when it came to, first of all, writing the entire book, but then like writing the relationship between Jess and Josh, and like I guess like being able to build up so much chemistry where at the start of the book, as a reader, you're just like, wow, this is great. But then like making like a massive U-turn in the middle, where it's like, okay, this is going to crash and burn. I have to just like leave them to it.
Yeah. Well, I will say that actually the book stresses me out too. And that's part of what I was trying to do with the book. Because when I started writing, well, I'll say first that I always conceived of this book as a love story. I've always loved a good love story, but I think even the very best ones can exist in binary. So, you know, there's like a bubblegum rom-com on the one hand and war-torn lovers and somebody dies at the end on the other. And I really wanted to write something in between, something more nuanced, something that felt real and contemporary. So I had this idea for a love story, but I didn't really have like much else. I just kind of sat down with this idea in my head, but I didn't have characters or a setting or a plot. And it was 2018, so it was kind of right in the middle of Trump's presidency, and I felt like the discourse had gone completely sideways. Like in the US at the time, I think there was this narrative to just kind of reach across the aisle, and that was really frustrating because it felt like it minimized like the very real concerns people had. And I think people were just reckoning. Like I think especially on the left, people were just trying to understand, who are we as a country? What happened? How did we get here? And so I was kind of in that headspace, simultaneously like sitting down to write a novel. And I saw an article in New York Magazine that was called "Donald Trump is Destroying My Marriage."
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And I was like, I hate this because, again, it was just this idea of agree to disagree. And that felt really minimizing and frustrating. But it also piqued my interest. I was like, who are these people? Like, how does this work? And so those were the questions that I was reckoning with as I was sitting down to write the book, which is why I think this book is almost my answer, or not answer, but my search for answers to that question. And I think, again, the fact that it's set between 2008 and 2016 is really important because it's hard to remember, but the world has changed so much. So in 2008, Obama won on a platform of hope and unity. And so I think people honestly felt like, yeah, like we're different, but there's more that unites us than divides us. And that was like a palpable feeling in the air. And so, not to like age myself, but I feel like when I was in college, it would have been totally normal to date someone and like not really know like what their politics were. But then fast forward, 10 years later, and it's a completely different world. Like politics kind of define us. Like it's hard to imagine like breaking bread with someone who disagrees with you politically, because I think the stakes are a lot higher. And so all that's to say, the novel is me grappling with that and also trying to sort of highlight how far we've come, sort of in good or bad ways. So I don't know if that exactly answers your question.
No, it does. And you mentioned, I guess, like searching for an answer. Do you feel like by the end of you writing the book, you had like a solid answer, like you came to a solid conclusion?
No, I think it was more processing. So I think I've always wrote to find out how I feel. Yeah. And so I don't think that I have answers, which is why I think, no spoilers, but the ending may feel a bit ambiguous. And I think it's because ultimately I wanted the book to feel like more of a ink blot test. So like whatever, biases or hopes or dreams or fears or concerns like the reader is bringing to the book, I hope that they can see, they can project that onto the book and they can sort of like get what they need, which is kind of how I wrote it. But yeah, I didn't write it with like an answer or any kind of like specific takeaway in mind. Although if you know me well, like you could probably read between the lines and figure out like what my take is. But yeah, I don't want to like do that work for the reader.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, as you said, like the ending was quite ambiguous, where it's just like, what does this mean? Like, what's going to happen between Josh and Jess? So I want to focus on Jess a bit, because I feel like Josh, on one hand, was quite like a blank character, where it's like he represented like the poster child of a privileged white man who has an air of like supremacy, or just able to do what he wanted. Whereas Jess was more nuanced, and when someone is like more nuanced, like you have to take your time to understand them as well as to like them. I feel like Jess, on one hand, again, represented Black women working in like a corporate space, and then on the other hand represented like a niche of Black women who had like particular like domestic experiences, who had like other interests and like desires. And I guess like I want to know what went into creating Jess on like both hands, like the one that the side of her that represented all Black women, and the side of her that represented like a group of Black women.
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess the first thing I would say is I acknowledge that Jess is flawed and maybe can be frustrating. And to me, that's kind of equivalent to saying that she's real. I think when I thought about writing a Black woman, I always wanted to write a novel with a Black woman at the center. One thing that I thought about a lot was kind of, who gets to be messy, who gets to be flawed. I think there's definitely been like a moment where there's a lot of like white characters, white women who are just like a hot mess, and people kind of love that. But it doesn't always feel like Black women are afforded the same grace to be sort of imperfect. And so that was important to me, because I feel like, you don't have to be the perfect victim always. Like Jess is very much a victim of racism, like externalized and internalized. And to me, it seems like, you deserve love and happiness and grace, no matter what imperfections you may be manifesting. And so that's, I think, why she feels so complicated, but hopefully why she also feels real. I think another thing that I really brought to bear with Jess was thinking about what is it like to be a Black woman or a Black person navigating white spaces. And I think that is a lot. Like yeah. So I think I wanted to kind of just highlight what that experience is like for one person and maybe how much work it requires to kind of evolve and sort of define yourself. Because I think in the beginning of the book, Jess defines herself in opposition to whiteness a lot, but it's sort of like she comes up short in her own eyes. Like she has this idealized version of like what someone should be. Maybe she also compares herself, for example, to this character Tenley, who's like this perfect blonde, like ideal of like womanhood. And then I think as she grows a little bit, she's sort of pushing back a lot, and she's saying, hey, this is me. Like she's wearing her hair naturally, for example, demanding that people kind of like take issue, like, say something to me about this. But there's still like that sort of, whiteness as like the default. And I think ultimately I wanted to show her, maybe not fully by the end completing that transformation, but like working to get to a place where she feels like she doesn't actually even need that frame, and she can just be who she is without, comparing herself to that like white supremacist ideal.
No, I really love how you explained Jess, because now that you've like explained it to me, I was like, yeah, that's actually right. Like when I was reading the book, I wanted more for Jess. It was like, maybe you just don't need a relationship. Maybe you just need some time to heal and like experience life and like just be out of this space that it seemed like she was fighting against the world as well as like at war with herself because of all her internal dialogue, and especially pertaining to her relationship with Josh. And I guess like when you mentioned Jess navigating like a white space, I wanted to ask more about how you wrote like Josh and Jess in opposition, because it was quite frustrating to read. Because I remember saying to a friend, where it's like, I can't imagine like going into like a predominantly white industry and feeling like I'm undervalued and everyone else is picked over me, even though I'm bringing like my best and some. And then going home and then complaining about said disadvantages and like basically unfairness to a partner that just didn't get it, and also like was benefiting from the fact that he was in that space and he was, what's the word? Like, what is the word? He was in that space and he was...
I mean, I don't know if this is the word you're looking for, but he's kind of blinkered. Like, I think he sees what he sees and he doesn't necessarily look beyond that frame. And I think it's because, and maybe this is getting to your question, he doesn't have to. Like, the world, they meet the world differently because they have different perspectives and backgrounds, but the world also treats them differently. And so in a lot of ways, like, Jess is asked to rise to challenges that he doesn't have to, and she doesn't necessarily relish the opportunity, but I think it's just something that, a lot of, marginalized people will understand. Like, sometimes you've got to fight the fight when you'd rather just sit home and sip tea. So I think when I thought about Jess and Josh, I hope that, the reader sees they have a lot in common, right? They share a sense of humor. They share some really core interests. I think they kind of understand each other in certain ways. But what is really different about them is, I think, just the context in which they were raised. So they're very much products of their environment. And I think that not a huge point that I was trying to make with the book, but one thing that I think is in there is that, you know, if Josh had been born, you know, a Black woman in Nebraska, and vice versa, if Jess had been born a white man in Greenwich, like, they could have been one another.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of the challenge of trying to make the world a better place, because there's just so much context that everybody brings to life that, you know, you can't necessarily erase. You wouldn't necessarily want to, but it can feel like an uphill battle sometimes.
Definitely.
Trying to reconcile.
It seemed like Jess took a majority of that on, while Josh kind of coasted and enjoyed the love in the relationship, the sex, the going out. It was like he was just completely oblivious to everything that she was experiencing, and I guess like sacrificing to be in a relationship with him.
Yeah.
And like whilst I was reading the book, I kept telling myself like it's a matter of political ideology, and what you mentioned earlier about now that like politics is such a big thing, and even when I think about dating, like, politics is actually such a big thing, because it's where you start off the initial conversation of like, what are your beliefs, like how do you see the world, and it was just so interesting to just see how they kept missing each other, because whilst Jess was so passionate about her, I guess like her political ideology and how she saw the world, and I could like relate to it, I also felt her frustration trying to explain that to someone, and I didn't feel like she should have to explain it to someone. She'd just be like that. She just makes sense. But yeah, I found it was very interesting how you wrote that. It's like a very frustrating situation.
I think it's really normal also. Remember, she's, you know, 22 when we meet her, to not necessarily know not only what you want, but what you deserve. And so I think that's part of her journey.
No, definitely. And it seemed like, the thing is, like, as you said, they had similarities. I think at the start of the book, that's why it was so exciting. And I was so excited for them. It's like, this is sexy.
Yeah.
If Jess doesn't kiss him, I will. Like, let's get this popping. And like a part of me was just always like, I wish it could have worked.
Yeah.
I wish it wasn't this stressful, because they were a good match. It was just that one perspective.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if this is the right term, but I think in a lot of ways I do think of them as star-crossed. Just because, again, like where they come from, like how they're kind of indoctrinated into the world, like that ultimately defines them, whether they want it to or not. And so, yeah, the question is, can the world be different, or can the world accommodate people who are so different? And I think the answer depends on, you know, what the reader brings to the book, but also it kind of depends on how the world changes or doesn't, or how it has changed or hasn't. So it's tough stuff.
No, it is tough stuff. My heart goes out to Jess.
Yeah.
And you did mention that, you know, when you were writing Jess, you kind of wanted to create a Black female character who was flawed, and I guess like you wanted them to like garner love and affection despite them being chaotic and flawed and not really knowing what they want, and like fighting against this idea that Black women have to be perfect in order to be accepted. And that definitely was Jess. And I absolutely loved how you wrote about her relationship with her father, and obviously I'm not going to spoil it, but the part of the book where she had to go home to visit her father was really tough to read. It just felt like she was off in the big city trying to make him proud. It seemed like, I don't know, it didn't, a part of me was just like, it seemed like she was chasing being in finance for a particular reason that was more to do with her father and wanting to like make him proud than staying true to herself. So when she went home and it was just like, it's all like a facade, like this is the real Jess, it made me really, really sad. And those few chapters was just so hard to read, because it's like, what's Jess gonna do?
I mean, I'm sorry that upset. It actually upset me to write, and I haven't really read it since I wrote it, because it is quite emotional. But I think you're right. I think that's a really good insight. Like Jess is missing something, but I don't think she initially lets herself really understand what she's missing. And I hope this is not a spoiler, but I think growing up without a mother, especially not having like a Black woman to kind of help her navigate the world, really works on her. And I think that may be the answer or part of the answer, but she thinks that she's missing something else. She's chasing money, she's chasing power, she's chasing status, and that's not really the answer. And so that I think is sort of why she kind of gets mixed up in some things that may feel as a reader a little bit frustrating, or like you want to like grab her by the shoulders. But I think that's pretty normal. And I think, you know, when we talk about her being flawed, I certainly didn't sit down and say, I want to write a flawed character. I think I just wanted to write a character who represented, you know, the world we live in and all of its complexity. And this is what I ended up with. But yeah, I think, and that's why this book, you know, isn't only a love story. I think it's very much a coming of age. She's just trying to figure out who she is, and there are certainly some bumps along the way. And I think sort of the combo of love story and coming of age is one that, you know, as stories go, is one of my favorite kinds of story. And I think because it's so powerful, you know, you're trying to find yourself and then you find someone else that maybe shows you who you are. And usually I think that means you end up coming together. But in this book, I think Josh shows Jess who she is, but then the question is, okay, given that, like, how do we make this work, and can we make this work? And so that's kind of the twist, and why I feel like this book has a little bit of bite. And yeah, I think that's something that I tried to do on the page.
No, and you've done it really, really well. And even speaking about like Jess missing something, it was so heartwarming when she started to get that sort of like maternal affection. It was like, oh, Jess, like, this is what you needed. You just needed a massive hug to braid your hair. You need someone to listen to you, and then go back to trying to become something in the world. It's like you go off and you, like, she was so ambitious, and even when she moved from one area of work to another, she was just really ambitious. She cared about people. She cared about making a change. And I guess what was missing was like who was taking care of Jess, inner child. Throw that out there. But yeah, I think you did so well in writing a character that changed and grew in a different way to how you think she'd grow when the book started. Like, it didn't end with her, you know, this huge success and her just like, you know, getting all this power. It ended with something a bit more subtle, but something a bit more hopeful as well. I guess like the last question is like whether, because a lot of people say that, you know, they put a small piece of themselves in their book. Did you put a small piece of yourself in your book? Does Everything's Fine represent any of your personal experiences?
Yeah, so I think I have two answers to that question. And one, I don't know if I'm going to regret saying this, but I think with Josh's character, so, you know, he's a bit of a difficult character for a lot of readers. You know, he has some points of view that I don't think sit well with a lot of people. So the question for me was, how do I make this story believable? How do I, you know, get readers to want to come along for this ride? And so I personally, you know, I don't know if likable is the right word, but I think there is enough to recommend Josh that the story works. And that's because I actually put quite a bit of myself into Josh, which I think surprises people, because obviously there are more biographical similarities between Jess and myself. But yeah, I think a lot of his naivete, like I share some of, I think ultimately he is not, because he's not been asked by the world, he's not as comfortable like facing some of the world's difficult realities. And so he, you know, turns to stats and data to kind of explain life's difficulties away. And I definitely do that. And I think a lot of his personality, his humor is a little drier than Jess's. I think that's all me. And so I think that's hopefully, you know, you're rooting for them somewhat. I think that might be why, because I sort of like brought my humanity to bear on Josh. But then also I think at work, I've also worked in corporate America. I've also worked in predominantly white places, just like Jess has. And so a lot of those experiences I was drawing from my own experiences, feeling, you know, overlooked, underestimated. And that's something I definitely wanted to say something about. And so that's also where you'll see a bit of me.
Amazing. No, I've said this maybe like 1,000 times, but I adored your book.
Thank you.
Like it was definitely more than a love story, offered all these different elements. It's such a nuanced read. So I can't wait for everyone to have the opportunity to read it and to really like dive into Jess as a character, her experiences, her relationship with Josh, her friendship, her relationship with her father. And it was just, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for reading it so generously too.
And thank you for sitting down and speaking
of course.
with me today, 'cause it's always lovely to hear about what's behind the book, like what goes into it. And I'm sure my followers and my supporters will appreciate this conversation.
Cool. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you.